Welcome to the Deep Dive. Get ready, because we're stepping back in time. Today we're kicking off a series exploring the generations of mobile networks that built the connected world we live in. And there's only one place to start, 1G. The very first generation. We've been diving into sources provided just for you for this deep dive, tracing the absolute origins of mobile communication as we know it.
Yeah, it's easy from our perch in 2025, surrounded by 5G and already talking about 6G, to forget just how seismic a shift the beginning was.
Right.
1G seems incredibly basic now, almost laughably so, but it was the necessary first step, the absolute foundation for everything that came after.
Absolutely. It really is like looking at the right flyer before the jumbo jet. So our mission today is to really get inside that foundational technology, what it did, what it absolutely couldn't do, and why, despite its massive limitations, it was genuinely revolutionary.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it. So before we even dive into 1G itself, let's maybe set the scene a bit. What did mobile communication look like before the 1980s when 1G started appearing? And what was the core technological breakthrough that finally made 1G possible, that moved us beyond those earlier systems?
Right. Well, before the cellular era, mobile was a completely different beast. We're talking incredibly limited systems, really niche stuff.
Okay.
Think two-way radios, like for police, fire, taxis, dedicated professional use.
Gotcha.
Or maybe those very early car phones, the ones permanently installed, often bulky and eye-wateringly expensive even back then.
Yeah, you weren't exactly making a quick call from the grocery store on one of those.
Not at all. No way. And the technical limitation was pretty fundamental. Those old systems typically used one single, very high-power transmitter trying to cover a huge area.
One big antenna for the whole city kind of thing.
Pretty much. And the physics of it just meant only a tiny number of people could use the system at the same time. You'd hit capacity almost instantly.
So you couldn't just build a bigger, more powerful transmitter and handle more users. It needed a totally different way of thinking.
Exactly. That wouldn't scale. And that's where the breakthrough happened, the cellular concept. The brilliant idea was to stop trying to cover everything with one giant signal. Instead, divide the service area into smaller geographic chunks.
Ah, the cells.
Right. They often visualize this as a honeycomb pattern, which is kind of stuck, and each section became a cell.
And that's literally where the name cell phone comes from.
Precisely. Within each of these smaller cells, you put a lower power base station. But the real magic, the thing that unlocked the ability to support vastly more users, was frequency reuse.
Okay, frequency reuse. How did that work?
Well, because the cells were smaller and used lower power, the radio frequencies used in one cell could actually be reused in other cells that weren't directly adjacent without causing interference.
Okay. So if you imagine that honeycomb, you use a frequency in one cell, skip the ones next to it, and then you can use that same frequency again a bit further away.
You've got it. So by breaking down the large area and strategically reusing those limited radio airwaves, you could suddenly have many, many more simultaneous conversations happening across a city or region.
That's clever.
It really was. It just exploded the potential capacity compared to that old single transmitter model. That fundamental shift from one big broadcast to a network of smaller interconnected cells using frequency reuse, that's the core concept that made commercial mobile service, starting with 1G, possible. And honestly, every mobile network since, right up to the 5G on your phone today, is built on that same cellular principle first commercialized with 1G.
It's kind of mind-boggling that such a, seemingly simple geometric idea was the absolute key.
Yeah.
Okay, so diving specifically into 1G itself then. What was its single most defining technical characteristic? If you had to point to one thing that made 1G, 1G.
The defining characteristic, the absolute core of 1G networks, is that they were analog.
Analog. Okay, like an old record player compared to a CD or an MP3.
That's actually a really good analogy. Think about modern digital networks. They take your voice, convert it into a stream of data ones and zeros, and transmit that digital information.
Right.
1G didn't do that. When you spoke into a 1G phone, your voice was transmitted as a continuous varying radio wave. It was much more like how traditional AM or FM radio broadcasts work.
So the actual, sound wave of my voice was somehow directly riding on the radio wave. Is that roughly it?
Essentially, yes. The frequency of the radio wave was modulated or altered in step with the variations in your voice's sound wave. This analog transmission was a huge step forward for mobile voice at the time, but it also brought with it some really significant limitations.
Yeah.
Limitations that ultimately sealed 1G's fate and really pushed development towards digital for the next step.
Right. Okay, we'll definitely get to those limits. But first, you've got these cells, you've got these analog signals. How did they manage the basic trick of keeping multiple different phone calls from getting all mixed up in the same cell area?
Okay, so they used a technique called frequency division multiple access, FDMA.
FDMA. Sounds technical.
It's pretty much what it sounds like. The total chunk of radio spectrum allocated for the network, the available airwaves, was divided up into a bunch of individual narrow frequency channels.
Okay, so like parceling out little slices of pie, maybe.
Exactly like that. When you started a call, your conversation was assigned one of these specific frequency channels, and you used only that channel, that slice of pie, for the entire duration of your call. Your signal just stayed put on that one narrow band.
And the problem there was
Yeah.
you only had so many slices of pie available in each cell, right?
Precisely. There was a finite and actually quite small number of these channels per cell. So if all the channels in a particular cell were currently being used for active calls, anyone else trying to make a call in that same cell would simply get blocked.
Blocked. Like what happened?
You'd just hear a network busy signal or maybe just nothing. It was a constant struggle in denser areas, a direct result of that simple one call per channel nature of FDMA.
Wow. Network busy. That really does feel like a relic from another age now, doesn't it?
It really does.
Okay, technology aside for just a second. Let's talk about the stars of the show, the actual phones, the hardware. What were the devices like that people were actually using on these 1G networks?
The iconic hardware. Yeah, if you've ever seen a picture of an early mobile phone, you are almost certainly seeing a brick phone. There's just no better description.
The legendary brick. I think everyone has that image in their head.
Yeah, the most famous one, arguably, is the Motorola Dynatac 8000X. That was the first one approved for commercial use in the U.S. back in 1983. And these things were absolute dinosaurs compared to modern smartphones. They were huge. I mean, huge and incredibly heavy.
How heavy are we talking?
We're talking around 2 pounds, which is almost a full kilogram. Just holding one up to your ear for a long conversation would genuinely give you an arm workout.
2 pounds?
Wow.
Wow. And I've heard the stories about the cost, too. Not exactly something you just picked up on a whim.
Oh, far, far from it. These were luxury items.
Yeah?
Pure status symbols for the elite, really. The price tag was staggering for the time. If you adjust for inflation, it's equivalent to well over $10,000 in today's money.
$10,000 for a phone.
Yep. This was technology for CEOs, stockbrokers, wealthy individuals who needed to be reachable or wanted to show they were.
10 grand for a phone you could barely hold.
Yeah.
And the battery life was apparently abysmal.
Notoriously bad. Just awful. You can maybe talk for about 30 minutes, maybe.
Yeah.
And then you'd need to plug it into its charger for 10 hours to get it fully charged again.
30 minutes talk time for 10 hours charging.
Yeah. Portability was definitely relative. You needed to be near a power outlet pretty regularly. It really makes you appreciate charging your smartphone overnight, doesn't it?
It really, really does. Okay, so you've got these massive, expensive, short-lived phones operating on this limited analog network with capacity issues. Given all of that, what was the one fundamental revolutionary capability that 1G actually introduced? What was the big deal that made it take off despite all those serious drawbacks?
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. For all its clunkiness, its cost, its limitations, 1G offered something absolutely groundbreaking at the time. Truly personal, untethered voice calls on the go.
Just talking anywhere.
That was it.
But think about it. For the very first time ever, you could walk down the street, you could sit in a park, be miles away from any landline phone jack, and make or receive a phone call. You were no longer tied to a wire coming out of a wall or a phone permanently installed in your car. It was the beginning of genuine location-independent communication for the average person, well, the average wealthy person initially.
It sounds so incredibly basic now, but I guess back then, that freedom must have felt absolutely incredible, like science fiction made real. It changed everything. It became an immediate status symbol, yes, partly because of the cost, but it was also a genuinely powerful tool, especially for business. It made people much more productive, much more reachable. Networks like AMPS, the standard in North America, started rolling out in major cities throughout the mid to late 80s.
Yeah.
And even with the high cost and the primitive tech, the demand was clearly there. It genuinely kicked off the mobile revolution simply by untethering human conversation from a fixed location. That was the killer app.
That act of untethering, that's the core revolution.
Yeah.
Powerful stuff. But as we touched on earlier, that analog nature and the early design had some really serious flaws baked in. What would you say was arguably 1G's single greatest weakness, its Achilles heel?
Without question, its most critical flaw, the one that really stands out, was its complete lack of security.
Lack of security. How bad could it possibly have been? We think about encryption today, but...
It was really, really bad because the calls were transmitted as simple, unencrypted analog radio waves. Remember, like FM radio? Anyone with a relatively basic, inexpensive radio scanner could easily tune in to the frequencies being used for calls and just listen to private conversations.
Wait, seriously? Like scanning through radio stations and you could just accidentally or deliberately stumble onto someone's phone call. That's alarming.
Exactly that. There was essentially zero built-in privacy or encryption. Business deals being discussed, personal calls, sensitive information. It was all potentially just floating out there in the open air for anyone with the right cheap gadget to hear.
Wow.
This fundamental lack of security was a massive, massive driver for the industry to move quickly towards digital technologies for the next generation, for 2G. It was such a glaring problem that it absolutely needed fixing fast.
You can definitely see why. Moving to digital encryption would be priority number one after that. Okay, so beyond that security nightmare, what other major drawbacks did these first-generation networks have? Because it sounds like there were a few.
Oh, several others that would make today's smartphone users just gasp. Firstly, and maybe the most obvious one looking back, absolutely zero data capabilities. None.
Nothing at all.
Nothing. 1G was designed only for voice calls. You couldn't send a text message. You couldn't check email. You certainly couldn't browse some nascent version of the internet. Nothing. It was a voice-only world.
Just talk, no data whatsoever.
That's it. Call quality was also frequently, let's say, variable, often poor. Analog signals are just inherently susceptible to static and interference, from electrical sources, other radio signals, atmospheric conditions sometimes.
Right.
This often resulted in crackly, noisy, kind of low-fidelity audio during calls. It wasn't always a clear line by any stretch.
So definitely not the crisp HD voice quality we kind of expect as standard today.
Oh, miles and miles away from it. And dropped calls were a really common frustration. As you moved from the coverage area of one cell tower to another, the network had to hand off your call to the next base station.
Right, the handoff.
And that process wasn't always smooth or reliable in those early 1G systems. Calls would just cut out mid-sentence sometimes. Very annoying.
Yeah, I can imagine. And we mentioned the capacity limits with FDMA earlier. That was a big practical issue, too.
Yes, that was a significant practical limitation day to day. Because each call used an exclusive frequency channel and there just wasn't a huge number of channels available per cell, busy areas like downtown districts during business hours quickly ran out of capacity.
So people just couldn't make calls.
Exactly. You'd try to make a call and just get that network busy message frequently, especially during peak hours. It was a major bottleneck limiting how many people could realistically use the service simultaneously in one place.
So, okay, major security issues, often poor quality, dropped calls weren't uncommon, absolutely no data features, and running out of space on the network. Seems like quite a list of problems. Were there any other surprising limitations we haven't touched on?
Well, one big one, especially for anyone who travels internationally today, the systems were completely incompatible globally, totally fragmented.
What do you mean?
Different regions adopted completely different, incompatible 1G technical standards. You had AMPS in North America, as I mentioned. Then there was TESCS in the UK, NMT in Scandinavia, and others elsewhere.
So a phone from one place wouldn't work in another.
Exactly. A phone bought for a 1G network in, say, New York simply wouldn't work on a 1G network in London or Tokyo, anywhere else, using a different standard. They just spoke different languages, technologically speaking.
Wow, so no international roaming whatsoever back then. Your expensive 2-pound brick was strictly a local or maybe national device.
Absolutely locked to its specific technological standard and geographic region. So, yeah, while it was revolutionary for enabling mobile voice in the first place, 1G was absolutely riddled with issues. Huge privacy fears, iffy quality, capacity crunches, zero data, and total global fragmentation.
It's really incredible to think how fundamentally flawed it was by modern standards. Yet, as you said, it was a massive success in its own way. What ultimately do you think is the lasting legacy of 1G despite all that?
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, 1G's legacy is actually profound, and you could argue it's because it was successful, despite all those flaws.
Okay.
First, it was the absolute proof of concept. It didn't just show that commercial cellular technology was possible. It proved there was immense, almost insatiable demand for this kind of freedom from both businesses and, eventually, the public. People were willing to pay a fortune and put up with all the downsides just to have that untethered mobility.
To prove the market was there, hungry for it.
Exactly. Second, its limitations were, in a strange way, a gift to future development. The very clear, very painful problems with security, with capacity, with call quality, and the total lack of data features these directly drove the research and development towards the next logical step. Going digital. 1G basically highlighted exactly what the industry needed to fix, and it paved the way directly for 2G and everything that followed. It forced the realization that the future had to be digital to overcome these issues.
So its failures were almost as important as its successes in shaping what came next.
That's interesting.
In a way, yes. They provided the clear engineering objectives for the next generation of technology. And third, and maybe this is the most significant long-term impact, 1G sparked a cultural revolution. It introduced the entire world to the very idea of the personal portable telephone. It was the very first baby step on the long path that has led pretty inexorably to the always-on, hyper-connected culture that defines so much of our lives right here in 2025. It fundamentally began to change our relationship with communication by, as we said, untethering conversation from a fixed physical point.
It wasn't just a new gadget. It was really the beginning of a huge societal transformation in how we connect with each other. So, okay, what does this all mean when we look back at 1G from our vantage point today, June 10th, 2025?
Yeah.
How should we view it?
Well, from where we stand now with 5G powering everything from, streaming high-def video on the bus to controlling smart cities, and with 6G research well underway, 1G feels undeniably primitive, almost quaint.
Yeah, primitive is a good word.
That analog tech, the voice-only calls, those enormous, heavy brick phones we talked about, the complete lack of privacy or data, it truly feels like it belongs to a completely different era of technology. Like looking at a steam engine from the age of bullet trains.
It absolutely feels like ancient history when you compare it to the slim smartphone in your pocket.
It really does. But despite that, its historical importance is just paramount. It wasn't just a step in mobile evolution. It was the essential, pioneering first step that launched the entire mobile revolution we're still living through.
The spark.
Exactly. It validated the cellular model, proving its technical viability and, crucially, its commercial appeal. And it laid the cultural groundwork, the commercial foundations, and even the technical groundwork by highlighting all the problems that needed solving for every single subsequent generation of mobile technology that followed, from 2G right through to 5G and beyond.
So before we could have streaming video, instant messaging, browsing the web from literally anywhere,
we first had to learn how to simply make a basic phone call while walking down the street. And it was the imperfect, the clunky, the insecure, but truly revolutionary 1G network that first gave us that incredible ability.
it really makes you think about that initial spark, doesn't it? Our sources, the ones we looked at for this deep dive, they talk about how 1G planted the seed for our whole modern connected culture and that big shift towards the always-on connectivity that pretty much defines our lives now.
It's a really fascinating connection to draw, isn't it? That seemingly simple innovation, just being able to talk on the go, untethered, was the absolute first step on a path that has fundamentally reshaped society, reshaped our expectations of communication, and maybe even reshaped our relationship with constant connectivity itself. Was 1G the real pivot point, the moment the foundation was truly laid for the always-on present we all inhabit today?
It's a compelling question to mull over, for sure. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into 1G, the very first generation of mobile networks. Understanding these origins, warts and all, really helps highlight the incredible complexity and capability packed into the devices and networks we often take for granted today.
Absolutely. It's such a clear example of how solving the limitations and frustrations of one generation directly fuels the innovation and capabilities of the next one, a constant cycle.
Couldn't agree more. If you found this look back at the very roots of mobile tech interesting, please do subscribe to the channel Tech AI and Beyond for more deep dives into the history and future of technology. Join us next time as we leave the analog world behind and explore the crucial leap to digital with 2G.